In this last chapter of this title, we're going to put together a lot of the information that you've learnt and build our own data-driven web application. The project that I've chosen for this is a discussion forum, because this will let us put into practice a lot of the things that we've learnt throughout this title. We're going to be basing our discussion forum on threads, which will be discussion topics which can be posted on by a number of different users that will subscribe to our forum. We also have moderators who will have special privileges that will allow them to do things that normal users can't. Let's take a look at the structure that we're going to use to build this forum. We can use the login system that we made in an earlier chapter with some slight modifications, but essentially it'll be the same basic login system that we used. So we'll use that as the entrance to the site. Then we'll need a page where the threads will be listed so that the user can see what are the most recent threads on the forum and view any thread that their user chooses and make their posts from viewing the threads. So we'll need a page to view the threads. We'll also need a page where the users can submit a new post or edit a post that they've already made, providing the user is the same user who originally put the post on the site. We'll also allow users to delete posts. Once again, users will only be able to delete their own posts. We will give to moderators the extra facility of deleting threads. We'll also let them delete any post, regardless of who submitted that post to the forum. Those are the only pages that we're going to need within this forum system. We'll also need an include script with which we can store the common functions that we're going to use within the whole of this forum on each page. Before we begin scripting, let's take a look at the database that I've created for the forum system. Once again, this database is included within the source code that's included on the CD. So if you use MySQL, then you can implement the database system on your own machine. The database is called Forum, and as we can see, there are 3 tables, one for each of the main entities of the forum system. And if we take a look at the users table, we'll see that it's based very closely on the user table that we made for the login system earlier on in this title. Some extra fields have been added, however. We're going to keep track of the number of posts that the user has made altogether with the total posts column. We're also going to store the user's email address, and we have 2 effectively Boolean columns, although the Boolean data type is not supported by MySQL. And these 2 columns are show email, which is whether or not the user wishes to allow their email address to be made public so that other users of the site can email them. And the other Boolean is mod, which is whether or not they've been assigned as a moderator and are therefore able to use the special privileges that we give the moderators within our PHP scripts. The threads table consists of only two fields: the thread ID, which is the primary key, and the title, which is the title by which the thread will show up on the main page of the site. We have a posts table as well. Now this doesn't show up too well in the MySQL command line because of the default date value is rather large, and so throws the structure of the description on the MySQL command line. However, we can see that there are 5 fields, and those are, first of all, the post ID, which is the primary key, and then this is connected to the user ID, by the user ID field to the users table, so that each post keeps a record of which user made that post. It also keeps a record of which thread the post is a part of, and that's kept by the thread ID field. We also have the body field, which is the text of the post. Then we're also going to keep track of a date posted field, which is going to store the date and time when the post has been submitted to our website. This will enable us to keep track of which thread has been posted to most recently, and thus keep the most recently posted threads at the top of the main page. In our next movie, we're going to start building the scripts for this forum. Let's start work on our scripts by modifying the old pages that we wrote for the login system to work with our forum system. One obvious thing that can be simplified about our login system is that on our logout page we have an option here to make sure that the user is logged in. However, if the user is not logged in, we also have an option here. Now, we could just as well take our entrance page, which is just pure static HTML, and include that data within the logout page where we've written you haven't even logged in yet, and we could turn the whole thing into the entrance to our site. So we can put our welcome message here, welcome to the great debate, and then we can have our unregistering information here. A better way to do this, perhaps, would be session destroy. That would make sure that all the variables that we've stored in our session have been removed. It might help as well if we arranged our page so that the welcome message came first, and we put the logout information after. Otherwise, this is pretty much the same. We could make these messages more explicit. And perhaps we could reverse their order as well. Otherwise, we're keeping this page pretty much as it was. However, another problem arises when we see that the logout title is displayed even if this is a new user arriving at the site for the first time. First of all, let's save our file under a different name so that we keep our old login system. And we're going to create a new folder. We're going to call it Great Debate. And we're going to save it under the name enter.php rather than logout, because this is going to be used as our entrance page primarily and our log out page as well. So we have the problem here that can be fixed by, potentially fixed by simply adding an echo statement here, and maybe we could add an echo statement down here that will say welcome. However, the problem now is that we now have the title of the page up here, and it's all starting to get a bit heavy if we're including a different title here and a different title here. However, it's very easy for us to find a solution to this, because setting up the page should be done in the same way for all of our pages within the forum website. So it would make sense for us to include a function that would set up the page automatically based on certain arguments that it's fed, rather than including copied data on a lot of different pages. We could do this by, if we open a new document, and we're going to save this one straight away as forum inc for include. We'll save that, and we're going to set up a function. We're going to call it setup page, and it's going to take a title and some header text. What this is going to do is it's simply going to set up all the HTML that we'll use within each of the pages that we're going to create. We'll be able to customize the title by including the title as an argument of the function. We'll also be able to customize what comes right at the beginning. We can put in a whole style sheet here so that we can specify exactly what each of our HTML styles should look like, and we can keep it consistent between pages. Because this is relatively simple, we're not going to use cascading style sheets. And really that's a whole different area of web technology that is irrelevant to PHP. But we can keep a certain amount of data in this internal style sheet, which is served by our PHP script onto every HTML page that the browser will receive. So we can set up a number of different styles to make sure that each of our pages is consistent. Here we're setting up the color for the hyperlinks. We're also going to have the colors for hovering over the hyperlink and for what they'll look like after they've been visited. So for the hyperlink, as we hover over them, we can use a bright yellow, and then after they've been visited, we could use an orangey red. That's our style part of it. And then our body, we can specify background color, and let's say we choose a deep blue. And we don't need to specify any particular text color because we've done all of that within our style tags. Although it might make sense in case for any quirks of HTML we end up outside of those particular styles. Then we're going to put in a logo, and I've included the logo on the CD, and we're going to need to put a copy of that within the directory on the web server's document root. And we're setting it up to put the logo at the top of every page. Then for our header, we're going to break out of the string for a moment, and we're going to include the head text, which is the variable that was fed to this function as an argument. Finally, we're going to set a variable that can be read outside of the function. So we're going to declare a global variable, and that's our function for now. Let's save that, and we're going to use this on our enter page. The way we do that is simply to include or we're going to say require. Include would do a similar job, and we need to keep that within PHP script. And we can take out all of this HTML formatting and simply go straight to the if statement. And instead of this here, which says log out, we're just going to ask it to set up page with the great debate, and it's going to be site entrance is what will be fed to the setup page function as the header for the page, and then we're going to have a welcome message here. I'm probably going to expand on that later, but that'll do for now. Then we can say, if the user has not been logged in, I beg your pardon, this is the choice if the user has been logged in, but if the user has not, then we need to tell them that they've been logged out. So we call the setup page function, and logout is the title we give to the page, and the same title for the header. And then we'll offer these same links as per normal. So this works quite similarly to our logout and entrance pages, but it ends up saving one of the pages. Before we preview that in our browser, let's make sure that the graphic file has been added to the directory that we just created. We need to copy the logo.gif file into the Great Debate folder. Now let's go to our browser and we can look up our entrance page. Great debate. Enter.php. And as we can see, we've been correctly identified as a user who's not been logged in, and so we've been given the message site entrance. In our next movie, we're going to continue to customize the login system for our form. So now we've combined two of the PHP scripts, or rather a PHP script and an HTML page, into one simpler and tighter PHP script. So we can close this one down. The next script that we're going to adapt is the login script. Now, to begin with, we're going to make this script comply with our new setup for the pages that we're going to be using to keep a consistent look and feel for this site. So we can take out all this HTML here, and we can go straight down to the first command, which is the links command here. And let's split this rather long line into two. We need to change the address from logout to the enter page. Let's save this into our new directory that we have here so that we can test it out. Next, we need to next change that we need to make is to include a setup page command in case the user has already been logged in. And we're going to set this up as already logged in will be the title, and whoops will be the header. Otherwise, we'll keep that part of the script the same. Now, we need to use, as we connect to our database, we need to use a particular username and password to get access to the database. In this case, Poseidon, and the password is Trident. Now, we will be doing a lot of this within our whole site. We'll be connecting to the database a lot of times, and we'll be selecting that same database from the MySQL databases available. So let's take that out of the script and include it within our include file right here. We're going to make a function called doConnect. We're going to take no arguments, and it's simply going to contain those two lines. One other thing that we can add is a pconnect, and this creates a permanent connection which significantly increases the performance of the connectivity with our MySQL database. So that's one thing that we can add to this particular function. Let's save that, and then in the login.php script, we can simply include a call to that function rather than specifically connecting to the database with a particular command. We can keep these lines the same, and here we've hit a problem, and how we've dealt with it within our login page was to in fact abandon the user and give an error message should there be a problem with the connectivity with the database. Now, this is not a very user-friendly way to do things. It would be better if we had a fail function in our include file that we could standardize the way our website is going to deal with problems. So let's set up a fail function, and this is going to take two arguments. It's going to take the message and a serious argument, which is going to be effectively Boolean. And what it's going to do is, if the set up variable is found to be true, which means that the page has already been set up by the setUpPage function, then we're simply going to show a whoops as header 2 style. However, if the page has already been set up, then we're going to call, I beg your pardon, if the page has not been set up, we're going to call the setUpPage function and set it up with the title error and the header whoops. Then we're going to show an error message and that within that error message we're going to include the specifics of whatever error has been triggered within the PHP script. Then we're going to test to see if it was a serious problem, and if it was, we're going to offer the user a way to get right back to the start, effectively logging them out. Whether they like it or not. If, on the other hand, it's not a serious error, then we just take them to the main page, presuming that they've already logged in. So all our errors before the user is logged in have to be fully serious errors that are going to take them back to the entrance of the site. Finally, it's a good idea to include some way that they can contact the imaginary technical staff of this imaginary website. And I apologize if there is a greatdebate.com and I trust that if you use this script, you'll make sure you change the email address given there to an email address more useful. So that's our fail function. If we go back to our login script, then we can give the much more useful fail function here. Database query failed login page. Then we can have a standard error function, but it's also outputted a unique bit of data that will identify, for instance, if they did contact some technical staff, they would be able to identify where the problem had happened, for instance. We could, in fact, turn this line into one line, seeing as it's only one command that's being carried out. Next, we're going to test to see if the user name that they've put in has been found. Now, whereas before we didn't have to actually do anything with that data, we just had to make sure it was found in our forum version of these scripts. We're going to have to include a little line to take the data that has been found by the query and we're going to include a user ID. So logged user ID as well as the user name, which is just what they've put in. And we're going to take that from the query that we just ran on the database. And then we're going to register that variable as well. Now, if you'll remember, we included a mod field within our users table, so we need to register the user as a moderator as well if they've been marked as that on the database. So we need to register that variable, logged as mod, we'll call it, and then all we need to do is echo the same welcome message. In this case though, we're going to use the setup page again to make sure that they get the right kind of, we just use the welcome there. When we show our invalid logging, we're going to use the setup page to make sure that the look and feel of the page stays consistent, and we're going to give them a specific complaint. Then we have the problem of two fields not being filled in. So let's just copy that setup page statement there, and we can leave that otherwise identical. And finally, if we arrive at this page without any of these conditions being true, then we need to set up the page once again as login and we need to ask them to fill in their details. Otherwise, this is going to be pretty much the same deal. We might want to add a little hyperlink at the bottom here to take the user back to the entrance to the site if they change their mind and want to register as a new user, for instance, rather than having to enter some phony data in order to have themselves rejected by the form. So we've saved that. Let's take a look. If we go to our entrance and we log in, there is an error on line 53. As we can see, I left off a curly bracket at the end, something that I do all the time, and I'm sure you'll have come across it yourself in your PHP scripts. Let's resave that and take another look in our browser. As we can see, Our login page now matches the look and feel of our entrance page. It won't work yet because we haven't added any of the other scripts to the folder on the document root of our web server. But in our next movie, we're going to take a look at adapting the rest of the login scripts to our new. The register.php script required some similar changes. For the sake of brevity, I'm not going to walk you through all of them, but let's have a look at the salient ones. To begin with, we've used the same includes that all the other files have. We've also added another field here, which is the email field. And this email field is input within the HTML form at the foot of the register page, and there's also a show email pair of checkboxes. We don't need to check for their input because there's a default value, so it will either be 1 or 0. Other changes that we've made that are significant changes are there's an extra query performed here. And what this does essentially is it takes the user ID after the user's details have been added, and it logs that with the session as logged user ID. Then the other changes are essentially stylistic changes where the look and feel of the site has to be maintained. The next important part that's been changed in the login system that we made before, if we save this into our Great Debate folder and close it. The next thing is the main. If we look back in examples, this main script here was what we were using in our login system before as the main page of the site. Now, because we really do have a site here, we're going to have to make a lot of changes to this script, and we're going to do that in our next movie. In this movie, we're going to set up the main page of the forum. And essentially, we won't need anything of what we had in our main.php file with the login system, because it was just a dummy system there. Now, we're going to include the forum.inc file, and we're going to test, first of all, to see if the user is not logged in. If they're not logged in, then that's a problem, and we need to use our fail function and let them know that they're not logged in was a problem. We're going to say true to the serious argument, and that'll pop them straight back to the entrance page where their session will be destroyed. If, however, they have been logged in, then we will set up a page that says the Great Debate as the title and topics for the debate as the header. Then we're going to list a number of threads, and we're going to set up a variable threads per page, let's say 12 to be conservative, and then we're going to set up an offset variable so that as we move from one page to the next, we are able to show a different set of threads depending on whether the user is moving back in time to older threads or forward in time to newer threads. So we'll need an offset, and if there's no offset when the user arrives, that means it's the first time they've arrived at the page, and therefore we need to set the offset to 1. We also need to add to our offset an increment variable. We're going to look at that a little later, to our threads multiplied by the number of threads per page. This increment variable will be passed from the navigation that we're going to include at the bottom of this page. We also need to register where the user is within the threads. That is the thread list offset variable. Next thing we need to do is connect to the database, which we're going to use with our function, and then we need to query the database with quite a complex query, and that's going to take the threads, the title of the threads, and then we're going to use the aggregate function max to find out the maximum thread, and we're going to call that latest. That's the latest thread to have been added to that form, to that latest post to have been added to that thread. And we're going to join those on the thread ID column in both posts and threads tables. Finally, we're going to include a limit on the number of records we're going to return. Which is the threads list offset -1, and then we're going to call the threads per page the actual limit of the number of records that's going to return. If we don't get a result from our database, we need to call our fail function. Now let's set up a variable which counts the number of rows in the result we got back from that query. Now we're going to set up a little part of the screen that shows the user. And we're going to, first of all, either specify if they're a mod or a user. And then we're going to put the actual username straight after that. And we're going to close that bold tag, and then we're going to have a link to the enter page, which is just going to say log out, so the user can easily log out at any point. Then we're going to store all the thread titles in a table on the page. And we're going to make our table with a border of 0, effectively invisible. And each First of all, we're going to set up something to identify what each of the columns means here. And in this case, it's going to be the thread title, and then we're going to include the date when the last post was made for that particular thread. Now we're going to set up a loop that's going to loop through all the results we've got back from our querying of the database. We're going to use a while loop to get every result that was returned. And with each result, we're going to show and we're going to make each of these thread titles a hyperlink. And we're going to include a link to the thread.php page, which is going to be the page where we can view all the posts within thread. Then we're going to have the actual name of the thread. Then we're going to close that hyperlink tag and the bold and the paragraph tags. And finally that column cell, that cell of the table rather. In the next one, we're going to include the there we go. That's the latest posting that was made to that particular thread is included in the right-hand column. Now we're also going to allow, if the user is logged as a moderator, the facility to delete any thread that they want to. And so we're going to include a hyperlink to the kill.php which we haven't written yet, but this is going to be the thread deleting, thread and post deleting and we're going to say delete thread as the text there. Then we're going to close all of these HTML tags. And finally, we're going to close the table. Finally, at the bottom, we're going to include a little portion of the script which is going to show where the user is within the threads. So if they're viewing the first threads that they could, then that will say 1 to however many of threads they're allowed to view per page, whereas if they're halfway through the available threads, it will show a different figure. Now we want to make the little navigational elements within this part of the so this little is a lesser than sign here, which could look a bit confusing amongst all the HTML, is actually a literal is less than that we're going to use to show the navigational direction left, which is towards an earlier part of the thread listing. And we're going to include something very similar over here. Except this is going to check to see whether the number of rows indicates that there's room to move higher in the thread listing. Now we're going to include, we should include a space with that less than sign. We're going to include a space before this greater than sign, and we need to, after that, close the hyperlink tag, and then if it's not true, if this condition here is not true, then we're simply going to input empty text. Finally, we're going to include a link to the post.php script, which we haven't written either, and we're going to include a variable on the end of that that's going to be picked up by the script, and that's called new_thread, which is going to indicate that the user wants to post a new thread, which is the message that we're going to display on the page as the hyperlink. Now, the data that I've included so far on the database is all pretty nonsensical. So when we test this page, it may not make a terrible amount of sense. If I change this enter to main, oh, then we haven't logged in, so we'll have to go back to our site entrance, and we'll register under a nonsense name. We'll give whatever password and log in. Oh, we went to log in rather than to the entrance. So give a nonsense name here, nonsense password, a supposedly valid email, and then we'll click the register button. Then we proceed to the Great Debate, and as we can see, this is how our threads are listed here within that invisible table. Our user name is stored there, we have a little logout prompt, and our 1 to 6 is listed here. And because we're right at the beginning, and I've only added 6 completely meaningless threads here, that means that there are not more threads that can fit on the page, and therefore neither of those little arrows, the syntax of which may well look very confusing at the end here, has shown up, because this was the part of that ternary that was evaluated, and so nothing was put in to either side of this part of this page. So that's our main page over with, and in our next movie we're going to look at the page on which a user will be able to post a new post on the thread.php script in this website is the longer script, and so I'm not going to type it all out, because if I did, then this movie would be horrifically long. So instead, I'm just going to walk you through what each part of the script does. To begin with, we start the session and use the forum.inc script that contains the common functions that we use throughout this website. Then it tests to see if the user is logged in. If they're not, then it fails them with the serious argument set to true, which therefore will bounce the user all the way back to the entrance page. If, however, somehow the thread ID has not been specified, then the user is only bounced back to the main page, which lists all the threads that we saw in our last movie. If the thread has been specified, then we need to register it. We're going to set arbitrary figure post per page equals 10, and then we're going to set the post list offset to 1 if it hasn't been set yet. This works in a very similar way to the way it does on the main page, where we're keeping track of if there are more, for instance, more posts than can fit on the one page, then we're keeping track of which part of the entire thread we're viewing. We need to register that with our session object. Next, we need to make a database connection using the function defined in the forum.inc file. And then we're going to query our database using this rather formidable piece of SQL. It's actually quite simple. There's nothing really complicated about this, it's just a little long. It takes from 3 different tables and it selects the name of the thread, the body of the particular post that we're going to show, the date on which that was posted, the name of the user's email, how many posts the user has made to date, and the field in the database that shows whether or not the user has their email shown, and we also need the unique ID of the post and the user. We're going to take it from these 3 tables, and the join is going to simply be that the thread ID in posts is the same as in threads, so we're getting the name of the thread for the specific post that we're calling, and also that the data from the user table is the correct data according to who made that post originally. The other criterion is that the thread is the thread that where, as the user, are interested in viewing. And we're going to order them by post date posted ascending, so that the oldest post comes first and that the thread can be viewed in the intuitive way, which is the beginning first, so that it goes, as you go down the page, you can read the conversation in context. We're going to limit the number of results to the number of posts per page, and we're going to start at the point at which we've arrived, if we've indeed have navigated from one set of posts to the next within this page. If anything goes wrong with that, we need to bounce the user back to the main page with a relevant error message. If no rows are returned by this query, then we can presume that somehow the post list offset variable has got mixed up, and that we're trying to call a post that doesn't exist. So we give an error message to that effect and bounce the user back to the main page. And then we need to pull out the results into a number of records with a while loop. And then this little condition here with the setup page in it, the reason we're doing this is that we need to set up the page using the name of the thread as the header for the page. So until we've actually pulled the first row using MySQL fetch associated array, we can't actually set up the page. Otherwise we just put it straight before the loop. But we're doing this within the loop so that we're able to have access to that data. But we only want to do it once. So we're going to check for this variable, is setup variable, which has been defined as global within our include file, so that it will only execute on the first iteration of the while loop. If we have a look now at one of the threads, then as we can see, the thread title is shown here, which is what we're doing with that piece of our PHP script. This part here, which shows the links and the username and the user status, which is user rather than moderator, is what we're doing with this line here. The main part of this loop is to show the details of the user and the piece of text itself that they've posted. So if we have a look here, as we can see, the user name is posted here, and then we have the date, and then how many posts the user has posted. The reason why this shows 0, I should explain, is that this post was added at an earlier point in the testing process, at which I hadn't added a facility to increase the number of posts. Now that the whole system works, every user should show posts, if simply for the fact that they've posted once. So we should never see this with any new users that you add. And here is the text of the post. Then we have a line below each post here. As we can see, each of these rows fulfills each of those pieces of data and puts it on the screen. We also have this line, which we're not seeing at the moment, and what that is the facility for the user to edit their own post, so that if they're the user, either if we were logged in as, say, Mr. X, then we would see the edit post hyperlink coming up here, where we could edit this particular post here and change it to whatever we want, or delete it. Since we're not logged in as Mr. X, we're logged in as this random series of letters, we're not being shown this. We would also be shown this particular piece of information if we were a moderator. And here's the condition that specifies that. If the particular user ID that has been passed back from the SQL query is the user ID that's been registered with this as a session variable, then we get to see this edit post. or if we're logged as a moderator. So that's where the condition is located. We store the body text on the page within these two functions, strip slashes. Now this takes out any slashes that were added to escape dodgy characters such as apostrophes that would have thrown out our SQL syntax. And so these are taken out again when we come to output the data onto the screen, and we use NL to BR. And what this little function does, very useful, is to convert all new lines, NL, to BR, which is HTML page breaks. I beg your pardon, line breaks, so that they will be correctly formatted when passed as HTML. Finally, there's that line at the bottom there. This end part of the thread.php script does a very similar thing to what it did in the main page. Let's have a look at what it's doing here on this page. And that is it's showing the numbers here, and since we don't have enough posts, we're not seeing the little arrows either side of the numbers which show what posts we're viewing at the moment. We also have these two hyperlinks, add reply and new thread. And both of these lead to the post.php script, except that one of them includes the new thread equals true variable along with the URL. In our next movie, we're going to examine the way post.php works. In this movie, we're going to look at post.php and look through each section and see the way that it works. To begin with, we start the session and load the common functions in forum.inc, and then we check to make sure the user's logged in. If they're not, we bounce them back to the entrance page right at the beginning of the website. If no thread ID has been specified, and this post is not the first post of a new thread, which it would be if, for instance, we had just come from the main page. Let's take a look at the thread listing, the main page, and if we roll our mouse over post new thread and then examine the address that comes up at the foot of the browser, the variable new thread is appended to the address post.php, and the value of new thread is set to true. So if it comes in with the new thread set to true, then a box is shown where the title of the thread can be added. However, what this condition is asking is if there's no thread ID, then that's a problem unless we're creating new thread. And if those things are both false, then it bounces the user out. This function trims off any white space at the beginning or end of the body, white space being trailing space characters or line breaks or tab characters and so on. If there is indeed a body that's been submitted to this page, now the body variable is submitted down here. In this field here, in a form. And this is the post text that is entered by the user, and then when they submit the form calls itself. So if we go back up to the top, we can see that if the body variable has been set, then we must have just come from the form. In which case, we need to add slashes to the body to escape any problem characters like apostrophes, then connect to the database. Then the code will branch again, depending on whether a post ID has been specified. Now, if a post ID has already been specified, then we know that the user has come from a different place to arrive at this page. We know that the user has chosen to edit one of their posts, and therefore is simply asking for the contents of the body field to be updated with the new data that they've just put in on the form. So that's what we do with this line. We use an update query to add the new data to our MySQL database. And provided that that works, we go on to set up the page post updated as the title, and we let the user know that they've updated their post as they wished, and we give them the links so that they can go back to either view the thread in context. The links are up here. View the thread in context, check out all the threads on the Great Debate, or log out and log in as a new user. Now, if no post ID has been delivered, then we move on to this branch. And once again, it immediately branches. If we're starting a new thread, then we have to set up a new record on the threads table. And so we use this query to insert a new record into the threads table. Then we have to find the thread ID of the new thread. And because thread ID is an auto-increment field, the maximum thread ID will be the thread that we've just added to the table. So we register the thread ID variable and move on. Now, if the user was not posting a new thread, but simply posting a reply to an existing thread, then this is the point at which the two threads, the two paths rather, of the script rejoin. And we run an insert query, and this inserts the post that the user has just specified in the form at the foot of this script. Given that that goes through successfully, we then want to update the users table to increase the specific user who has just added the post, increase their total posts column by 1. Then we need to tell them that they've successfully added their post, and we can exit the script. Give them the links to go to wherever they want to in the site, and then exit. However, if the post ID variable is true, it says, but because up here we've had this if body, then this will only be reached if we've come to the page new. That is, this is the first time we've arrived at this page, and it hasn't just been called by itself through the HTML form at the foot of the script. If that's the case, then we need to connect to the database and select the particular post that's been requested. This condition here makes sure that the user is editing a post and not making a new post. However, the two paths rejoin at this curly bracket here, and then we add the title here, and there's a set of nested ternary conditions. This line may look a bit confusing, but it's essentially a set of ternary conditions that if a post ID is specified, we must be editing a post. However, if it's not, then another choice, if we're on a new thread, then we want to say that we're posting a new thread. If not, we want to say we're posting a reply. That's just a complicated way of, I should say, that's just a concise way of achieving something complex. We edit the mistake. We call the setup page function with title as both of the arguments. We then move on, and this set of lines will set up the part of the screen at which these options are given, the options to log out, and the username is mentioned. Then we have the HTML form, which we've already looked at briefly. Now there's one part over here on the actual submit part of the form. Oh, this is a separate form, this form down here. This is a single form that only contains the delete button. And this delete button will only be seen if we're not editing a thread, which is why we're not seeing it in the browser at the moment. So let's return to a thread listing. And we may have to log out, in fact, so that we can try this out. And we're going to log in as Mr. X. I know that Mr. X has a posting on Jabberwock, so because Mr. X is Mr. X, he can see his own post showing up, edit post. And in fact, because Mr. X is listed in the database as a moderator, he can also edit anyone else's post. But let's make him edit his own post for now. And as we can see, because we're editing a post, the delete button is shown. Now, when we click the delete button, we get this prompt to see if we're really sure that we want to remove the post. Let's do it. And we get the post deleted. If we return to our thread, go back into another post, also by Mr. X, try to delete, and then cancel, what we effectively have is a second chance if we decide we don't want to delete the post after we've hit the delete button by accident. And the way this is achieved is by serving a JavaScript, because once PHP has been submitted to the browser, to the server rather, all that comes out is HTML or script intended for client-side processing. There's no way we can achieve that kind of effect for a dialog box popping up with pure PHP. So we have to use this little piece of JavaScript. What that does is it calls an onSubmit function, and that will return either true or false depending on whether the user has clicked yes or no on the pop-up box that appears. If we take a look at our forum.inc, you'll see that I've added the piece of JavaScript here. It doesn't really matter how this JavaScript works. That's outside the remit of this title. But the reason why I'm including this function is that it demonstrates the way that a JavaScript can be served just like any other HTML or any other part of the page from PHP. It's a useful way that client-side and server-side scripting can work together. I haven't used hardly any of it within this title, but it's something that you should be aware of. And in this case, this is a fairly safe piece of JavaScript to include, because if we disable JavaScripts, for instance, to simulate what would happen if the HTML with the embedded JavaScript arrives at a browser that can't handle JavaScript, then the button will simply presume that it should click through and delete the post without a prompt. So it will still work. It won't have that extra safety catch, but it will still work with our non-JavaScript enabled browser. So that is our post form, and that sums it up for our post.php script. And in our next movie, we're going to look at the last page in this dynamic website, which is kill.php, where users can remove their posts and moderators can remove both posts and threads. The kill.php script is the script that, as I mentioned at the end of the last movie, is called when the user either wants to delete one of their own posts or their own moderator, and they want to delete a post, be it belonging to them or someone else, or it could even be a whole thread. First of all, the kill.php script starts a session, installs the functions that are stored within forum.inc, and then tests to make sure the user's logged in. If they are, then we connect to the database. And at this point, the script branches because there are two different paths that could be followed. First of which is if it's a post that the script is being called on to delete, in which case it's a simple matter of issuing an SQL query that deletes that one particular post with that post ID. And since the post ID is a unique primary key field, we can be sure that we're only deleting that one post. If, however, it's a thread that the script is being called on to delete, then there's an extra step to be carried out. First of all, the thread has to be deleted using a MySQL query, and then the posts that make up the thread also have to be deleted to save space on the database and to fully execute the action of deleting a thread. Even though they be inaccessible, there's no point deleting the thread if they're not saving the space. If, however, neither variable has been specified, then the page must have been reached by accident somehow, and so an error message is given and the user is bounced back to the main page. In main.php, I've added this JavaScript as part of the HTML that's echoed to the browser within a table. And this piece of JavaScript is set to an event on the submit button, I beg your pardon, on the delete hyperlink, which is right next to each of the threads on the main page if the user is logged as a moderator. This works in a very similar way to the JavaScript that is served up by post.php. However, this time the name of the user, the logged in user, is included as part of the JavaScript, so that when in our browser we go to delete one of the threads, the JavaScript prompt actually uses the name. Now, let's take a quick look at the source of this page. If we look right down to where the JavaScript is written, as we can see, there's nothing magic about this. The reason that JavaScript knew the registered session variable is that it's part of the whole page that has been posted to the browser by the server. This is another example of the ways in which client-side and server-side scripting can work together in harmony. Very similarly to what we're using on the post.php page. So that sums up the kill.php script and the whole of this final project, and therefore the whole of this title PHP. I hope you found it useful and that you continue to use PHP and learn more about PHP, and hopefully that at some point you find yourself in a position where you can give back to the PHP community. Whether this be through contributing to the open source project that is the ongoing creation of PHP, or whether it's simply by the shining examples that you will create of good PHP scripts.